Well, welcome back. We're moving on to a new study in biology. Throughout history, many cultures have had some kind of creation story. In other words, how all the living things that we find in the world came into being. Well, in the year 1849, a man by the name of Charles Darwin from Great Britain published a book that revolutionized the thinking of people in his day regarding this question of the origin of all living things. And Charles Darwin took a different approach than what other people had done prior to this point. Now, there are many different ideas that people have about how the diversity of life came into being. And Charles Darwin is not the first to believe that natural processes could bring about life. Previously, we've looked at this and called it spontaneous generation, that non-living things become living things. Charles Darwin took a new approach to try to explain the diversity of living things. So I want to briefly go over the main points from his book that was published in 1849, as you can see, known as Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. What is this idea of natural selection? And does it have the power to explain all of the diversity of life that we see in our day? It starts out with the idea of natural variation. We can see in many organisms that there are many variations of the same kind of organism. And that's true in Darwin's day. It's also true in our day. In 1825, Charles Darwin sailed around the world on a ship called the HMS Beagle, and he made many observations, particularly in South America and on the Galapagos Islands. And he observed that there are many variations of the same kind of organism, and some of these seem to have a survival advantage better than others do. So individual organisms in nature differ from one another, and much of this variation is inherited. In other words, it's passed down from one generation to another. So we begin with natural variation. It's also true that many organisms produce more offspring than actually survive. Many of them die, many of them don't reproduce. So we have an overproduction of organisms. And so therefore, if there's going to be an overproduction of organisms, that's going to lead to this competition. Because there's more organisms that are produced than can survive, members of each species must compete with one another for limited resources. Of course, they have to compete with other organisms as well. And what are the things they compete for briefly? Well, it would be mating privileges. It would also be space. Certainly it would be food and water, nesting habitat, and so forth. And so over a long period of time, Darwin suggested this, that only those that are the fittest for that particular environment, best suited for that environment, would be able to reproduce more successfully. The characteristics that make them best suited are passed, therefore, on to the next generation. And these are the characteristics that tend to be preserved within the species. And those characteristics that are not as well suited, Darwin suggesting that they are eliminated from the population. Now, if you recall in our study of genetics, that's actually much harder to eliminate a gene completely from a population than Darwin realized, which Gregor Mendel's work seemed to suggest that there are traits that can skip generations and still reappear later on. Well, over the course of time, this idea of natural selection or survival of the fittest, Darwin has suggested that there's going to be an alteration in that species over a long period of time. In other words, Darwin suggested that new species could arise as the environment changed. This would lead to change in those species. And then some of those are going to disappear and become extinct. And this leads to another point, what's known as phylogeny or descent with modification. He's suggesting that over the history of life, species alive today have descended with modifications from species that lived in the past. Well, we can examine this by looking at the fossil record. In fact, a lot of that was done in Darwin's day. As the railroad beds were cut through mountainsides, many fossils were uncovered. And many of these were very curious and amazing in many points. And then finally, and this is the most controversial claim that Darwin made, is that all organisms on Earth are united in a single tree of life by common descent. And so all living things are related and have descended from a common ancestor at the very base of this tree. And those in Darwin's day and down to our day, there are those that are openly skeptical about whether this idea of natural selection is this powerful to result in all the diversity. It's also fair to say that there are the majority of biologists today that wholeheartedly endorse this idea of common descent. Well, there you have, in brief, Darwin's idea: survival of the fittest, competition, variation in species, and this idea of common descent. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.